There are a lot of great outfeed table and workbench designs out there, but is there one that's truly the best? For my shop there is, and I'm going to show you how I built it. This outfeed table, assembly table, workbench, kind of do-it-all bench is the center of my small shop. It is packed with work holding features and a ton of storage to help keep my small shop organized. Let's begin by going over the design and the features of this bench. The front features a main bank of 4 drawers, a second column with 5 shallow drawers for hardware and small part storage, and 2 pull-out trays below that. Next is a vertical pull-out that will be used to mount various handheld power tools. The last section on the front is an open compartment to house a shop vac and mount a bench vise. On the back side, there's another main bank of drawers identical to the one on the front, 2 pull-out trays, and a vertical pull-out where I will mount air tools, which is right next to an open compartment for my air compressor. The work surface is 3/4 inch black melamine and has T-track along both long edges and 2 rows of T-track perpendicular to the vise, which can be used with a stop block as bench dogs. The top measures 78 inches long, 40 inches wide, and 34 inches tall, with some adjustability from leveling feet. The carcass is constructed of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. I designed it to be a grid of dividers that fit in a series of dados cut into the top and bottom. Alright, enough with the drawings, let's build something. I first cut the top and bottom to size, each from a single sheet of plywood. I can then begin cutting the dados to fit the internal dividers. For everything to match up and remain square, it's important that the dados on the bottom and top are an exact mirror image of each other. To cut matching dados into both parts with a single setup, I made a dado jig for my router to accomplish the task. This is a massive 8-foot version of the jig Tamar at 3x3 Custom designed. She has an excellent video on making and using her jig, which I will link in the description below. After setting the jig to the thickness of my plywood, I can place it on my layout marks, clamp it in place, and cut the dado. For the longer dados, I used an extra clamp block in the middle of the jig to ensure it didn't flex since it is so long. I cut the first half, slid the middle block out of the way, then cut the rest. After cutting dados in each end of the top and bottom, and in the long dado down the middle of each, the rest mirror each other and only go halfway across the width of the carcass. I then positioned the sheets next to each other in the correct orientation. I then laid the 8-foot jig across both sheets and could cut the remaining dados, ensuring they are an exact mirror of each other by bridging the jig across both sheets at once. I thought this method worked very well, and the results look exactly like what I drew up. Next, I need to cut the internal dividers. To end up with a flat bench top, these all need to be exactly the same height, kind of like a big torsion box. To do that, I cut them all on the table saw to ensure a consistent size. Once all parts were cut to height, I cut them to final width to fit each side of the cabinet. Now at this point I put feet on each corner to elevate the bench and attached leveling feet and casters too. However, once I got some weight on the bench, I quickly realized this was a poor design and one of them failed before the build was complete. I later replaced them with this, which is 2 2x4s glued together and screwed through the top of the bench. So far, this has been working out great. The last step before assembly is to cut a notch in the top corner of the middle divider. This will allow me to install a power strip across the full width inside of the bench. Now I do a quick dry fit and mark out the location of my dividers on the top so I know where to drive nails. I then start gluing and putting everything together. This was actually a more difficult process than I expected and took about an hour and a half total. It was tricky and required a lot of persuasion to get all the parts aligned and fit into the dados at once. It seemed that every time I got one part aligned, another would pop out and I would have to start all over. After some frustration, I started tacking them in place with brad nails as I got them fit to keep them in place. I used a straight edge to make sure things were as flat as possible at this stage and to make sure there were no big bulges where the top wasn't seated into the dado. And used lots of brad nails to hold things in place while the glue set up. Now I needed to figure out how to flip the whole thing over to glue the bottom side. I guess time to man up and just do it. The same process is repeated on the bottom side. This time I had a few stubborn spots that I had to drive screws in to keep it seated flat. One last check for flat and the carcass is assembled. To make the working top, I cut down a 4x8 sheet of 3/4 inch black melamine to be slightly larger than the carcass top. I secured it in place by drilling holes with a stop collar and driving screws in from the bottom. At this point, things were really coming together and I may have gotten a little too excited.
This is awesome.
Once I calmed myself down, I used this flush trim bit to cut the melamine top flush with the carcass.
I'll be installing this 7-inch Yoast quick release vise on this bench, designed just to attach to the underside of the bench. However, my top is not thick enough, so I'm gonna have to add a spacer block. So I've already measured and made a block. This is just simply 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood. Put the block in there. That's gonna leave me at a perfect height because I'm gonna install T-track in this top, and I want the T-track to be able to clear the top of the vise jaw. So that'll leave me plenty of room. So I'm going to go ahead and attach this block and get this vise attached to the bottom of the bench. I'm going to pre-drill holes in this spacer block before I mount it. So I just have the vise upside down here and mark out my holes. I'll be mounting with these 2.5 inch leg screws. Got the center of the opening and center of my block marked here. So I'll line those up, clamp it in place. Drill a 1/4 inch hole through the block, which will be a pretty loose fit for these legs. So I'm going to drill a smaller 3/16 hole into the bench, make sure it has a good bite. I'm going to go ahead and tack this block with a couple 2.5 inch brads and then drive the legs through with the vise, and that'll be what actually secures it.
I wanted to do something unique for the vise jaws, so I decided to mill a board from wood off my property.
Out here at my wood pile, I'm gonna find some piece of firewood to saw into lumber to use for the jaws of my vise. So let's see what we can find.
I'm gonna make a cut right here. Get rid of this, and then I'm going to try to cut my planks across here and get mostly quarter sawn, rift sawn, a couple of pieces out of there with this crane going like that.
Well, it was so cold my camera quit working before I saw the log, but this is what I ended up with. From there I milled it flat and square with the jointer and planer and had 2 nice pieces to use for the vise. I cut out a recess to fit around the back jaw and added a nice chamfer around the edges. The back is attached to the top of the bench with countersunk screws. Then the front jaw clamped in place and secured. And look at there, it clamps. I then ripped some poplar strips to trim out the top. Cut a chamfer along the top edge and then nailed them in place. I couldn't bear to leave the corners looking like this, so a matching chamfer was cut onto each using a hand plane. And oh baby, we are looking nice. Well, there's still plenty to do, but we're going to stop there for now in this video. Stay tuned for the next video to see how I finish outfitting this bench with the rest of the storage and work holding solutions that I have planned.